They didn't expect much from a bankrupt veteran. They didn't expect much from a half-lame cavalry horse. But when Ethan Cole drove his rusted pickup into the snowy Montana wilderness, with nothing but a toolbox and a scarred Mustang named Valor, something impossible began to happen. What started as a desperate escape to a crumbling border outpost turned into a revolution. A quiet revolution of wood, memory, and firelight. He wasn't just building a cabin, he was building a second chance, and by the time spring finally melted the snow, what rose from those ruins would leave everyone, his children, his neighbors, even himself, utterly speechless. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us bring you more stories just like this one. The apartment didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a crime scene. The beige carpet was gone, ripped out and hauled away, leaving only bare wooden planks that showed every speck of dust in their grooves. The walls were naked. No pictures, no shelves, just faint, ghostly rectangles where sunlight had once faded the paint around framed photos of a life that no longer existed. In the corner by the sliding balcony door, a single cardboard box sat like an orphan. It was sealed with worn packing tape, and scrawled on the side in thick black marker was a single word: Misk. Inside were the fragments of a shattered life, papers that didn't matter to anyone but him. 2 cracked picture frames, the glass spider-webbed with fractures, and a rolled-up horse bridle that smelled faintly of oiled leather and sweat. On the kitchen counter, next to an empty coffee mug, lay the letter, the final notice. The words were brutal in their simplicity. Eviction. Effective immediately. He'd read them a dozen times, but the meaning never softened. This was it. The end of the line. Ethan Cole stood in the middle of that empty living room. He was 52, tall but worn lean, his shoulders still carrying the ghost of a military posture. His hair, once jet black, was going silver at the temples with a speed that felt violent. The navy blue field jacket he wore was frayed at the cuffs, the unit patches long since removed, but their faint outlines were still visible, like scars on the fabric. It wasn't just the apartment that was hollow. Something inside him was empty, too. Something had been leaking out of him for years, drop by drop. The house was gone, signed away in a sterile courthouse 3 years ago. The marriage, gone with it. The steady job repairing agricultural equipment had vanished in the last economic downturn. And whatever compass he used to navigate his life, he'd left it behind in a desert overseas, a place of sand and fire that still haunted his dreams. Through the grimy window, down in the cracked asphalt parking lot, his last real companion waited. Valor. The big Mustang stood tied to a lamppost, his head held high, ears swiveling to catch every sound. His coat was a deep chestnut, almost mahogany in the fading light. He stood with a calm that was ancient and rooted, a stillness that Ethan envied. Years ago, Valor had been a cavalry training mount at Fort Carson, Colorado. Ethan had worked with him during mounted patrol exercises. They had grown old together, 2 relics built for a kind of work nobody seemed to need anymore. Valor was half lame, his gait a little stiff, but his spirit was unbreakable. The old saddle was slung over the tailgate of Ethan's battered pickup truck. He could almost hear the rhythmic jangle of its buckles in the wind, the sound that had been the soundtrack to long, slow rides under a blistering desert sun. He murmured to himself, his voice a ghost in the silent apartment. Just you and me now, huh? Down in the lot, Valor turned his head at the sound, his nostrils flaring. He stamped a hoof once, then twice. A low, steady thump against the pavement. It wasn't a sound of nervousness. It was an acknowledgement. I hear you. I'm here. Ethan packed the last box with a deliberate, agonizing slowness. There was no reason to hurry. He had nowhere to be. Not really. But every movement felt like closing the cover on a book he wasn't ready to finish reading. On the counter sat one last photo, still in its frame. It was him, Sarah, and the kids. Maya had missing front teeth. Luke was barely old enough to stand without wobbling. They were in a park, surrounded by autumn leaves. His arm was around Sarah's shoulder, and she was smiling at him. A genuine smile from a time before the silence had crept in between them. He hesitated, his thumb tracing the edge of the frame. Then, with a sigh that seemed to pull from the soles of his feet, he slipped it into the box. The apartment felt heavier now that it was truly empty. He turned for one last look, and for a split second, he could hear echoes of laughter. Maya shrieking as Luke chased her, Sarah calling them in for dinner, but the sounds were only in his head. He locked the door behind him, the metallic click echoing down the empty hallway like a gunshot. He didn't look back. The pickup's engine coughed to life on the second try. He eased it out of the parking lot, the small U-Haul trailer clanking behind him. Valor shifted his weight in the horse trailer, the wooden floor groaning in protest. Ethan took the on-ramp to Highway 93 and pointed the truck northwest, toward the mountains. The city bled away behind him, replaced by low pines and the first rugged slopes of the Bitterroot Range. It was mid-autumn, and the wind off the higher peaks carried the first sharp promise of a brutal winter. He didn't have a real plan. He was heading for a memory, a story his father had once told him about an abandoned border outpost deep in the Lolo National Forest. A weathered pile of timber that had once been manned by a few lonely men, watching a stretch of nothing for trouble that never came. "It has good bones," his father had said. It was a place without people, and right now, that was all Ethan needed. A place to vanish. The radio sputtered between static and gospel music. He switched it off. The only sound left was the hum of the engine and the low rattle of the trailer hitch. An hour passed, then 2. The road began to climb, hugging the side of a cliff, and that's when the first warning came. It wasn't a sound, it was a smell, hot oil and burning dust. Then, as the truck rounded a sharp curve, it hit him, a sharp, metallic crack of an explosion from somewhere up ahead. Logically, he knew it was probably a construction crew blasting rock, but his mind didn't operate on logic anymore. In a single, horrifying instant, the asphalt under his tires wasn't asphalt. It was sun-baked desert sand. The crisp mountain air turned thick and scorching hot. Dust stung his eyes. The low hum of his pickup engine became the deafening roar of an armored Humvee. Someone was shouting orders, but the words were drowned out by the whip crack of rifle fire in the distance. His chest constricted, his hands clamped around the steering wheel, knuckles turning bone white. A cold sweat broke out on his neck, and his heartbeat slammed in his ears, so hard and fast it shook the edges of his vision. The mountain road was gone. In its place was the jagged, broken outline of a walled compound. He could hear boots pounding on packed sand. He was back there. A short, sharp sound cut through the haze of his memory. It came from behind him, through the thin metal walls of the trailer. Valor. A brief, almost impatient whinny. Then came a solid thunk of a hoof striking wood, steady, measured, thump, thump, thump. It was a sound Ethan had heard 1,000 times during formation drills. The rhythm was precise, exact, as if the horse were marching in place. A cavalry horse, remembering its training. He latched onto the sound, focusing on each beat, dragging himself back from the brink. Thump, inhale, thump, exhale. The sand under his boots became asphalt again. The shouting faded. The rifle cracks dissolved into the whisper of the wind over the cab. The smell of pine returned. His grip on the steering wheel finally eased. He pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder, shoved it into park, and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was immense. Absolute. For a long moment, he just sat there, his forehead resting against the cool plastic of the steering wheel, his breathing ragged. When he finally stepped out of the cab, the air was so sharp with cold, it felt like a slap to the face. He walked back to the trailer, his boots crunching on the loose rock. Valor's head was visible over the half door, his ears forward, his eyes calm and intelligent. Ethan laid a hand on the horse's warm neck, feeling the steady, strong pulse beneath the skin. "Good job, partner," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "You brought me back. Again." Valor didn't move, except for a slow, deliberate blink. The kind of blink that always made Ethan feel like the horse understood everything. The road ahead stretched into the deep shadow of the mountains, disappearing into the trees. Somewhere past those ridges, an empty outpost waited. It wasn't a plan. It was just a direction. He climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and rolled forward. This time, he left the window cracked, just enough to hear the steady beat of Valor's hooves if he needed it again. He was driving toward his last hope, or his final resting place. He wasn't sure which. The road narrowed without warning. After 6 hours behind the wheel, the last 2 spent navigating winding switchbacks, Ethan eased the pickup onto a rutted dirt track. Grass grew high down the middle, whispering against the truck's undercarriage. 100 yards in, a wooden gate sagged drunkenly across the path. The sign nailed to it was mostly splinters, the paint worn away to a ghost. But if you knew what to look for, you could still make out the stenciled letters. U.S. Forest Service. Lookout Station 9. He pushed the gate aside. It practically disintegrated in his hands. He drove on, the truck crawling over loose stones, until the forest broke open into a clearing. And there it was. Lookout Station 9 wasn't just abandoned. It looked like it had been forgotten by God himself. To the left stood a cluster of log buildings, their siding bleached a skeletal gray. The largest one had a porch that was missing half its boards, the front steps sagging like a tired old man. Beyond them, a steel watchtower rose 3 stories into the air, its frame streaked with orange rust. The ladder leading up was missing rungs. At the very top, the cabin's metal roof was peeling away, a loose vent flap banging a lonely rhythmic tune in the wind. Clank, clank, clank. To the right was a horse barn, or what was left of it. The entire left side of its roof had caved in, scattering cedar shingles across the ground like fallen leaves. One of the stall doors had been torn from its hinges and lay half buried in a sea of weeds. The air around it carried the faint, sour smell of old hay gone to mold and the ghost of manure from animals long dead. It was a graveyard of a place, but if you stood still enough, you could almost hear it. The murmur of long-gone voices, the ring of a hammer on a nail, the snort of a horse in its stall. But those sounds belonged to another lifetime. Ethan killed the engine. The silence rushed in. The wind moved through the pines with a low, mournful hiss. He stood there for a long time, just looking. The gas tank was nearly empty. His cash was even lower. There was nowhere else to go. This was it. He walked back to the trailer, unlatched the ramp, and stepped aside. Valor backed out with the slow confidence of a horse who had seen it all. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, taking in the sense of his new, broken home. There was no fear in him, only a quiet alertness. "Not much to look at," Ethan said under his breath, running a hand down the horse's powerful neck. "But it's got a roof, more or less." He glanced around. To anyone else, this was wreckage, a pile of garbage. But to him it was a pause, a place to catch his breath. The smallest of the main buildings still had 4 walls and a roof that was mostly intact. That made it the winner. The door groaned in protest as he pushed it open, the hinges shrieking like something in pain. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sharp tang of rodent droppings. Spiderwebs draped from the ceiling like funeral shrouds. He propped the door open and spent the next hour sweeping out the filth. Leaves. Dust. The desiccated body of a squirrel curled in the ash pan of a cold, rusted stove. 2 of the 4 front windows were smashed. He nailed warped plywood over them, not to keep out intruders, but to keep out the wind. From the truck, he brought in his old sleeping pad and unrolled it in the center of the floor. Home, sweet home. Valor's stall took longer. He found one section of the barn where the roof still held. He cleared the debris, pulled down an armful of dry grass from what was left of a hayloft, and scattered it over the floor. He ran a hand through the horse's mane. "We'll start from here," he said quietly. Day 1. Darkness came fast in the mountains. By the time he'd finished, the light in the clearing was thin and blue, and the first stars were punching through the twilight. The wind coming down from the ridge rattled the loose metal on the tower, making a hollow, almost human sound. Inside the cabin, the cold seeped in like water under a door. Slow at first, then all at once. He sat on his sleeping bag, fully dressed in his jacket, arms wrapped around himself for warmth. The only light was the dull orange glow from his battery-powered lantern. The only sound was the occasional pop of a branch breaking somewhere deep in the woods. This darkness was different from the city. This was a thick, absolute dark, something you could almost feel on your skin. Sleep, when it finally came, brought the desert with it. The heat pressed down, men were shouting. The ground shuddered with distant explosions. He could taste grit in his mouth. His rifle was heavy in his hands, but when he tried to raise it, his arms felt like lead. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world tilted. But then through the chaos, a new sound began to cut through. Slow, rhythmic, thump, thump. Not gunfire, not boots, hooves. The blistering desert narrowed, folded in on itself, collapsing down to the steady, solid beat of a single horse's weight shifting on wood. The dream dissolved. Ethan jolted upright in his sleeping bag, his heart pounding, his breath tearing in and out of his lungs. The cabin was black as ink. His ears strained, and he heard it again. Outside. A gentle scraping sound like the edge of a hoof drawing a line across rough planks. He pushed himself up, found his boots, and stepped out into the biting cold. The clearing was silvered with frost. Valor stood in his stall, his head over the rail, one foreleg shifting just enough to make that sound again. His eyes caught the moonlight, dark and steady. Ethan walked over and laid his forehead against the warm crest of the horse's neck. His own breath clouded in the air between them. "Still keeping watch, huh?" he whispered. "Good job." He just stood there for a long time, listening to the slow, even rhythm of the animal's breathing. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the darkness didn't feel like an enemy. It just felt like night. The morning broke cold and gray. Ethan was crouched beside a small ring of stones, coaxing a fire to life, when he heard it, the distant hum of an engine. It grew steadily louder, an alien sound in this wilderness. A red pickup truck rolled into the clearing and stopped. A man in a navy blue postal service jacket climbed out. "Morning," the man called, his breath a white cloud in the air. "Saw your name got forwarded out this way. Figured I'd drop these by." He handed Ethan a small stack of envelopes, then turned and drove away, vanishing back into the trees. There were 3 envelopes. 2 were bills. He tossed them into the fire. The third was heavier, the cream-colored paper smooth under his thumb. The handwriting on the front was Sarah's, his ex-wife. His fingers hesitated before he slit the flap open. Inside was a thick card, printed with looping, elegant cursive. "Sarah and Michael are getting married. You are warmly invited." He stopped reading. The air in his lungs seemed to turn to ice. Her face swam in his vision, not as she was now, but as she had been, laughing, her head resting on his shoulder on a warm summer evening. Her eyes in that last year, not angry, just tired, so incredibly tired. "You're still here," she'd said, "but you're not here." She had moved on, publicly, officially, and he was here, in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a pile of ruins and a ghost for a companion. He set the invitation down on the splintered porch step and pushed himself to his feet. "Work," he muttered to the empty clearing. "Just work." He went to Valor's stall, bucket of feed in hand. But the horse was acting strangely. His ears were twitching, and he kept shifting his weight toward the far corner of the stall. He pawed at the wall once, then twice. A hollow thunk echoed against the weathered boards. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, setting the bucket down. Valor struck the wall again, this time with more force. The plank trembled. Ethan pressed his palm against it, and the wood gave slightly, as if it wasn't fully attached. Before he could investigate, Valor swung his massive head and nudged the spot hard with his muzzle. There was a sharp crack. The board gave way, falling inward with a burst of dust and rotten wood, and behind it there was a hidden cavity. A space no bigger than a suitcase carved out of the wall. Something sat inside, glinting dully in the dim light. It was a metal box, about the size of a bread loaf, its surface mottled with rust. A simple latch held it shut, but it was fused by decades of corrosion. Ethan took out his pocket knife and pried at it until the latch gave way with a screech of protest. The lid creaked open. Inside, wrapped in a faded strip of canvas, were three things. First, a small, leather-bound notebook, the cover cracked and soft with age. Second, a bronze medal in a tarnished case, a U.S. Army Commendation Medal. And third, a black-and-white photograph of a young man in a crisp uniform, standing ramrod straight in front of the very same watchtower that loomed over the clearing. The set of his jaw was as unyielding as the mountains behind him. Ethan picked up the notebook. The pages were yellowed with age. The first line was written in blocky, deliberate handwriting. CPT, George Harris, Lookout Station 9, 1967. The entries weren't a diary. They were a watchman's log, short, precise, and filled with a quiet strength. He flipped through the pages. October 12th. First snow on the ridge. The quiet is absolute. It either breaks a man or forges him anew. And then another entry, a few pages later, that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. November 5th. A watchman doesn't just guard the land, he guards himself against the emptiness. Not everyone will understand why we stay, but we understand. And that's enough. Ethan traced the words with his thumb. Whoever Captain Harris had been, he had known this place. He had known this silence. He had fought the same shadows. Ethan carried the box back to the cabin and set it carefully on the warped table, right next to the wedding invitation. The contrast was brutal. One was a future he was not a part of. The other was a past that felt eerily like his present. He sat there for a long time, just looking at the two objects. One pulled him back into a world of pain and loss. The other offered a strange, unexpected handhold in the darkness. He felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was connection. He wasn't the first lonely soldier to stand guard in this place. He looked out the open doorway at the rusting tower. Harris had stood watch there. Maybe this place wasn't just a ruin. Maybe it was still serving its purpose. A quiet thought, but it glowed in the cold cabin like an ember. He closed the metal box, leaving the medal and the photograph inside. But he kept the journal. He rested a hand on its worn leather cover. "If you could stay," he whispered to the ghost of Captain Harris, "then maybe I can too." Outside, Valor shifted in his stall, the sound of hoof against wood steady and unhurried. The fire in the pit had burned down to embers, but through the trees, the wind began to rise again, carrying with it a faint echo of the words on the page. We understand. And that's enough. The next morning, Ethan woke up with a new sense of purpose. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was rebuilding. He started with the cabin, shoveling out years of filth and decay, the dust swirling in the thin morning light. He worked until his back ached and his hands were raw, hauling the debris to a pit and setting it ablaze, the flames consuming the past. Then he moved to the barn, clearing the rotted manure and splintered wood, creating a clean, safe space for Valor. He found a stash of old planks behind a collapsed shed, weathered but solid, and began the painstaking work of patching the holes in the cabin walls. The hammer felt good in his hand. The rhythmic thud echoed through the clearing, a sound of creation, not destruction. As he worked, Harris's words from the journal echoed in his mind. The greatest enemy of a watchman isn't the bullet, it's the rot. Ethan paused, looking at the fresh plank he'd just nailed into place. He wasn't just fixing a wall, he was fixing a hole in his soul. The roof was the real challenge. Sections of corrugated tin had peeled back, curled and rusted. He salvaged an old rickety ladder, braced it with rope, and began the dangerous work of climbing. He hauled salvaged tin sheets up, one by one, the wind tearing at his jacket, threatening to throw him from his perch. He worked until the light faded, then rose the next day and did it all over again. By the time he hammered the last panel into place, the sun was setting, painting the western ridge in strokes of gold and orange. He stood on that patched roof, looking out over the clearing. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, a vast, green ocean. And for the first time, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He discovered something incredible. When his hands were busy, his mind was quiet. The ghosts of the desert faded. The sounds of helicopters and rifle fire were replaced by the rasp of a saw through wood, the ring of a hammer on a nail, the steady, contented breathing of his horse. The work became a kind of meditation. Every measured swing of the hammer pulled him deeper into the present moment, into a space where physical exhaustion left no room for mental anguish. He wasn't a patient anymore. He was a builder, a caretaker. The cabin and the barn weren't ruins. They were raw material. By the end of the week, the change was undeniable. The cabin was sealed against the wind. The barn smelled of fresh straw, and Valor had a dry, clean place to stand. That evening, he sat on the front step, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands. Valor grazed nearby, untethered and calm. The watchtower loomed in the twilight, its top platform still sagging, a bigger job than he could handle alone. But the thought no longer terrified him. He would get to it, one piece at a time. He pressed his palm against the smooth, cool boards he'd nailed into place that morning. "As long as my hands hold," he said quietly to the trees, to the ghost of Captain Harris, "I'll keep going." The wind in the pines seemed to whisper in agreement. A few days later, he was out in the yard, cutting boards for a new barn door, when he heard it again. An engine. A silver SUV rolled into the clearing. His children. Maya stepped out first, a nurse in her gray medical jacket, her face etched with a familiar worry. Luke followed, his crisp shirt and leather shoes looking comically out of place in the wilderness. Ethan felt a familiar sigh build in his chest. He hadn't called them. He hadn't told anyone where he was. They must have found out through the mail forwarding. Valor, sensing the tension, got to his feet and moved to stand just behind Ethan's shoulder, a silent, solid guard. "Dad," Maya said, her voice careful, "I've been calling. We were worried." "Signal's weak out here," Ethan said, his voice flat. Luke's eyes swept over the half-repaired buildings, the piles of lumber, the general state of organized chaos. "What is this place?" he asked, a sharp edge of judgment in his tone. "It's home," Ethan replied. They went inside the cabin. It was clean and dry, warmed by the small iron stove he'd managed to restore. But Maya's eyes darted around, taking in the bare rafters, the shelves lined with tools instead of books. "Dad, this isn't living," she began, her voice pleading. "There's no electricity, no running water. What if you get hurt out here? There's no one for miles." "I've got clean air," Ethan said, his voice calm. "I've got work to do, and I've got quiet." Luke stepped forward, his patience clearly wearing thin. "We're trying to get your VA paperwork processed. If they find out you're squatting in an abandoned ranger station, they're going to flag you as unstable." Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not unstable. I'm healing." "You need a doctor, Dad," Maya insisted, her eyes welling up. You need medication, not a hammer and a pile of rotting boards. His gaze didn't waver. No doctor ever had to hold a perimeter in the dark. These boards, they have a story. They understand. Luke's frustration finally boiled over. So what? Fixing this dump is going to cure you? It's not going to change the diagnosis, Dad. You have PTSD. You're depressed. You're not hiding from the world. You're just building a fancier cage for yourself. The words hit him like a physical blow. He didn't respond. He just stood there, the silence in the cabin growing heavier with every passing second. Finally, he turned and walked out the door. He led them to the barn, showed them the new gate that swung smoothly on its hinges, the patched roof, the clean stall. Maya murmured something to Luke under her breath. The words were low, but in the still mountain air, Ethan heard them clearly. It's like watching a kid build a treehouse. His back went ramrod straight. Maybe to you this is just a treehouse, he said, his voice cold and hard. But every board I've nailed, every leak I've patched, it's a reason to stay alive. And it's the first time I've felt alive in years. The visit ended in a strained, awkward silence. They hugged him, quick and restrained, the kind of embrace that holds back more than it gives. As their SUV disappeared down the dirt track, Ethan stood alone in the clearing. He wasn't angry. He was hollow. They had come all this way, but they hadn't seen him at all. They had only seen his diagnosis. That night the cold felt deeper than usual. He sat by the stove and opened a new, clean notebook. On the first page he wrote, Day 15. They came. They didn't understand. But I can't blame them. There was a time I didn't understand myself either. He looked out the window at the dark shape of the barn where Valor stood his silent watch. We'll keep going, Ethan said into the stillness. Not for them, for us. And from the darkness, he heard the soft creak of leather as the horse shifted its weight, as if in agreement. He was alone. But for the first time, he wasn't lonely. The morning air was sharp, laced with the faint scent of wood smoke. Ethan was on his knees by the hearth, cutting replacement boards, when a figure emerged from the mist-shrouded pines. An older man, wearing a scuffed leather jacket and a faded ball cap, carrying a walking stick he'd clearly carved himself. He moved with a slow, steady stride, completely at home in the rough terrain. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and raised a hand. Hope I'm not intruding, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Been seeing smoke from the old station's chimney. Figured someone had moved in. Ethan set his saw down but remained cautious. Just trying to make a place for myself, he said. The man's mouth twitched into a half-smile. Ralph Jennings, live a few miles over the ridge. Used to fix the army generators up here back in the day. Ethan nodded once. Ethan. Ralph's eyes moved slowly over the yard, not with simple curiosity, but with the keen assessment of a man who understood the language of wood and stone. He ran a hand over a newly replaced wall panel. Pine from the north side of the range, he said, almost to himself. Frame still solid. Just needs patience. For the first time in days, Ethan felt a genuine smile touch his lips. Got more time than I know what to do with, he admitted. Ralph looked up at the half-patched roof of the barn. You rip out all those old rafters, you'll waste half their strength. But if you know how to brace them right, you can keep the old structure. It'll hold. He studied Ethan for a long moment. I've got the old schematics in my shop, and the right tools. You want some help? Ethan hesitated. Accepting help was not in his nature, but Ralph wasn't offering charity. He was speaking the shared language of work, of building. Finally, Ethan gave a short, sharp nod. Ralph didn't ask about Ethan's past. He didn't mention the VA or therapy. He just sat on the porch step, lit a broken cigar, and asked, You planning on staying, or just passing through? Nowhere else to go, Ethan said simply. Ralph nodded. taking a long drag from his cigar. When my wife passed, I rebuilt our whole house from the foundation up, not to forget her, just to remind myself I could still make something worth standing in. The quiet that settled between them was comfortable, solid. "Still got the generator in that old shed?" Ralph asked, pointing. "It's there," Ethan said, "rusted solid." "I can fix it," Ralph said. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. "You'll need lights before the first big snow hits." It was more than the promise of electricity. It was the way he said it. "We can do this, not you should do this." Something inside Ethan's chest, a knot he hadn't even known was there, began to unclench. Ralph stood up, slapping a broad, calloused hand on Ethan's shoulder. "A lot of folks think living out here is running away. I see it different. You got your hands, you got wood, you got fire. You're still standing. That's not running. That's fighting." He turned to leave. "I'll bring that drill back in the morning." "I appreciate it," Ethan called after him. "Not used to folks offering a hand." Ralph paused and looked back over his shoulder. "Not a hand, a trade. I'll show you how to get that generator running, and you teach me how to work with a horse again. Been years." As if on cue, Valor appeared at the edge of the paddock, his ears pricked forward, a low nicker rumbling in his chest. Ethan's smile came easier this time. Deal. As Ralph disappeared back into the trees, Ethan looked at the cabin, the barn, the looming tower. For the first time since he'd arrived, he didn't feel completely alone. He had an ally. Late the next afternoon, Ethan and Ralph were working on the old storage shed behind the barn. The structure was sagging, its walls barely holding together. Ralph was cutting through a rusted hinge with a handsaw, while Ethan cleared debris. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. Valor stood just outside, poking his head in curiously every few minutes. A loud hammer strike from Ralph startled the horse. Valor shied back, then lunged forward in a nervous movement, his powerful shoulder brushing against the side wall of the shed. The wall didn't just tremble, it collapsed. A whole section of rotted planks crumbled inward, dissolving into a cloud of dust. And behind it, in the dim light, was something else. A thin, box-like compartment, cleverly hidden behind a double panel. "Well now," Ralph said, lowering his saw. "Looks like this old place has a few more secrets to give up." Ethan pulled away the remaining splinters. Inside sat another dented tin box, this one smaller than the first, covered in decades of grime. He carried it out into the light and pried the lid open. The smell that wafted out was the scent of forgotten memories. Dry paper, cedar, the faint ghost of a woman's perfume. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were not the relics of a stranger, but the fragments of his own life. He lifted out a photograph, its edges curled with age. It was him, young and proud in his dress uniform. Beside him stood Sarah, his then-wife, one arm looped through his, the other holding a toddler-aged Maya. In the foreground, a baby lay swaddled in a carrier, Luke, impossibly small. Beneath the photo was a tiny plastic hospital bracelet. The print was faded, but he could still read it. Cole, Luke. 2:46 a.m. 6 LBS 9 OZ. The last item was a piece of paper, folded into thirds, the creases worn almost to tearing. He opened it carefully. It was a child's drawing, done in wax crayon. A lopsided horse with a stick figure man on its back, and scrawled underneath in bold, crooked letters, "My hero, Dad. Maya, age 6. Ethan froze. His hands began to tremble. It wasn't the past he'd tried to forget. It was the past he thought he had lost forever. These things must have been in a box he'd stored at his parents' house years ago, a box he assumed was long gone. Somehow, it had ended up here. But how? The question was a mystery for another time. Right now, all he felt was a tidal wave of emotion. The pressure in his chest wasn't pain. It was the feeling of armor, worn for a decade, finally cracking apart. Ralph said nothing. He just stepped back, giving him space. Ethan's thumb traced the uneven letters of Maya's childish handwriting. He used to be a hero, not because of a uniform, but because a little girl with missing front teeth believed he was. He folded the drawing back along its worn lines and placed it gently back in the box. He finally understood. Memories weren't a weight to be carried, they were a foundation to build upon. That evening, the tin box sat on the table by the stove. The firelight flickered across the old photograph, the tiny bracelet, the crayon drawing. Ethan and Ralph sat in silence, drinking coffee. "Things like that," Ralph said finally, nodding at the box. "They can knock a man down, or they can stand him back up." Ethan took a slow sip. "I used to think survival was about forgetting," he said, his voice thick. "Now, I think it's about remembering what's worth fighting for." He looked around the small, warm cabin, the patched walls, the mended roof, the faint, steady hum of the generator they had finally coaxed back to life. "I want to turn this place into something more," he said, a new resolve hardening in his voice. "Not just a shelter. I want to build a fort of memory, a place to keep the things that made me who I am." Ralph's mouth curved into a rare, full smile. "Then we're going to need a nameplate, and a hell of a lot more nails." Ethan laughed, a real, deep laugh that bounced off the cabin walls. It was a sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. By morning, the idea had become a plan. He unrolled a sheet of paper and began to sketch a map. The main cabin would be the heart, with a memory wall for photographs and keepsakes. The shed would become a memory gallery for his military gear and other artifacts. The watchtower, once they secured it, would be an observation deck, a place for quiet reflection. And the barn, of course, would remain Valor's quarters. When Ralph saw the map, he nodded slowly. Not a museum, a living history. "Exactly," Ethan said. "I'm going to write my own story before someone else tries to write it for me." That afternoon, they found a solid plank of straight-grained pine. Ethan took a hand chisel and began to carve, letter by letter. Fort Memory, founded by Ethan Cole, 2025. When it was done, they mounted it on the rebuilt front gate. Valor stood beside them, his warm presence a comfort at Ethan's back. Ethan rested a hand on the horse's neck and looked at the sign. The fort wasn't just a place to hide anymore. It was a declaration, a place where a man had chosen to rebuild his life, one memory at a time. He was no longer running. He was making his stand. By the first week of November, winter had arrived. Not gently, but like an invading army. The air was a blade. The ground froze solid. If Fort Memory was going to survive, it had to be ready. Ethan and Ralph worked from dawn until dusk. They tore out the warped floorboards in the cabin and replaced them with tight-fitting tongue-and-groove pine. Ralph showed up one morning with heavy rolls of mineral wool insulation, and they spent a week packing it between the wall studs, sealing every crack and draft. Heat was next. Ethan salvaged a rusted, broken cast-iron stove from a scrapyard in town. It took him 3 days of grinding, sanding, and oiling to bring it back to life. When he finally lit the first fire, the iron glowed a deep cherry red, and a wave of dry, powerful heat filled the room like a living thing. He turned his attention to Valor. The barn was snug, but the paddock fence was rotten. He spent 3 days setting new posts in the frozen ground, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Valor watched him, a silent supervisor, occasionally nosing a new post as if to check its stability. When the last rail was fastened, Ethan carved a small sign and wired it to the gate. Valor's range, comrades' quarters. Ralph snapped a picture with his cracked phone. "That horse has a better home than most people I know." Ethan brushed wood shavings from his gloves. "He's earned it." The watchtower was their final, most daunting project. It leaned precariously, its stairs little more than splinters. They poured new concrete footings, braced the corners with steel rods, and strung high-tension wires to anchor the structure against the winter gales. Ethan replaced every single stair tread, his hands growing numb from the cold. 2 weeks later, they stood together on the upper platform, the new railings firm beneath their hands. The wind was sharp, but the view was breathtaking. The entire fort was laid out below them, a small pocket of order and warmth in the vast, snow-dusted wilderness. Ethan took a paint marker from his jacket and wrote across the beam above them. Watch post, Fabi 1. For those still looking toward the light, the generator was Ralph's masterpiece. He dismantled it piece by piece, cleaning, repairing, and replacing parts scavenged from junk yards and old lawn mowers. On the night of the test run, they stood in the darkened cabin, flashlights cutting through the gloom. If it blows, Ralph said with a grin, at least it'll be spectacular. Ethan turned the key. The starter coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life with a low, steady rumble. A bare bulb in the ceiling flickered and then flared, flooding the room with warm, golden light. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Ralph let out a long breath. We have power. Ethan sank into a chair, just staring. It wasn't just light. It was a victory against the darkness, both outside and in. In the days that followed, the fort truly became a home. Curtains made from surplus army canvas went up on the windows. He hung the old family photograph on the wall above the table. The memory box sat on a shelf, its contents a quiet reminder of what he was building for. One night, as snow sifted down outside, Ethan stood by the window, looking out at his small, illuminated kingdom. The wind howled, but inside it was warm. The fire was steady. The light was unwavering. He smiled, a small, genuine smile. I'm not fighting winter, he thought. I'm living in it. The fort of memory wasn't an idea anymore. It had walls, it had heat, it had light. It had the shape of a life being rebuilt, plank by plank, breath by breath. It was a gray January afternoon when Ralph's pickup crunched through the snow. He climbed out, a strange, amused look on his face. Got some visitors coming up the road, he said, not looking at Ethan. Seems word got out you're not so crazy after all. Before Ethan could ask what he meant, another engine sound drifted through the trees. Smoother, newer. A silver SUV appeared, the same one his children had driven months ago. It rolled to a stop outside the gate. Luke stepped out. He stood still for a long moment, his eyes wide, just taking it all in. The last time he'd been here, this place was a wreck. Now it looked like something out of a magazine. The cabin was solid and welcoming, a thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney. The barn was neat and tidy. The watchtower stood straight and tall against the winter sky. He looked from the perfectly stacked cords of firewood to the new, sturdy gate with its carved sign. His expression shifted from doubt to disbelief, and then to something that looked a lot like awe. He stepped inside the cabin. The warmth from the stove hit him first, followed by the smell of fresh coffee and wood smoke. The floor gleamed. The furniture was simple but solid, built with a craftsman's care. On the walls, framed photographs and small engraved wooden plaques told a story of healing and hard work. Luke turned to find his father standing in the doorway, watching him. For a moment, they just looked at each other. I've never seen you like this, Luke said finally, his voice low. Like you're actually here. Ethan didn't answer with words. He just nodded and gestured for his son to sit. They sat at the table, the silence between them different this time. It wasn't tense or awkward, it was comfortable. Luke looked around the room again. When did you learn to do all this? He asked. Ethan slid his journal across the table, the one he'd started after his kid's first disastrous visit. Luke read the entries, his eyes tracing the descriptions of the repairs, the small victories, the quiet reflections. When he looked up, his expression had changed completely. The judgment was gone, replaced by a deep, dawning respect. "I never thought," he began, then stopped, searching for the right words. "I never thought this was how you'd find your way back. I used to think survival was about fighting," Ethan said softly. "Turns out, it's about hammering a nail straight, writing a sentence, boiling water for coffee. Each one is its own kind of victory." Luke let out a long, slow breath. "We called this your hermit's bunker," he admitted. "Maya was ready to file a petition with the VA, try to get them to force you back to town." Ethan chuckled. "I figured as much. But now—" Luke's eyes swept the room again, lingering on the photographs, the steady fire. He looked back at his father, and for the first time, he saw not a patient, but a man. "Now, I see someone who got lost and found his own way home." They talked for hours. Ethan told him about the panic attack on the mountain pass, about finding Captain Harris's journal, about the long, cold nights before he and Ralph had gotten the generator working. He didn't make excuses. He just told his story. "I wasn't running away," Ethan said finally. "I was running to the only place I could rebuild." When Luke stood to leave, the sky was already dark. He paused at the door. "If you don't mind," he said, his voice hesitant, "I could come back next weekend. Bring some of my woodworking tools. I could help." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest, brighter than any fire. He kept his voice level. "There's always work here for a good pair of hands." Luke nodded, then hesitated again. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on yourself." As the SUV's taillights disappeared into the snowy darkness, Ethan knew something fundamental had shifted. The fort was no longer just his sanctuary. It was becoming a bridge, a place where a broken family could begin to rebuild, one plank, one conversation, one shared cup of coffee at a time. A week later, Ethan sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter. Not an email, not a text. A letter on heavy cream-colored paper. Saturday, 5 p.m., first dinner at Fort Memory. There's a warm fire and a man learning to be a father again. He addressed it to Maya, Luke, and Karen, the daughter-in-law he'd never even met. He gave it to Ralph to mail in town. He wasn't sure they would come, but he prepared as if they would. Saturday arrived under a sky the color of pewter, with snowflakes drifting down like ash. He cooked a venison stew, its rich aroma filling the cabin. He baked cornbread. He set the table he'd built with his own hands with a checkered cloth and a jar of dried wildflowers. He brushed Valor's coat until it gleamed. He lit the lanterns in the watchtower, making it glow against the falling snow. The entire fort seemed to hold its breath, a small, warm beacon in the vast winter wilderness. The crunch of tires on snow broke the silence. The silver SUV rolled to a stop. Maya stepped out first, then Luke, then a woman with dark hair and kind, intelligent eyes. Karen. She looked from the glowing tower to the tidy barn to the welcoming cabin, and a slow smile spread across her face. "This doesn't look isolated," she said softly. "It looks like home." Ethan swung the gate open. He didn't explain, he just led them inside. The four of them sat around the table, the warmth of the fire on their faces. The tension from their last visit was gone, replaced by a comfortable, easy atmosphere. Karen complimented the stew. Maya laughed, a real, unforced laugh. The sound was warmer than any fire. After they had eaten, Ethan stood up. "I want to show you something," he said quietly. He led them to a door at the back of the cabin. Above the frame he had carved the words, "The Memory Room. For what remains." Inside, the walls were lined with photographs, old family pictures, his military commendations. Tucked in a corner was a small, wrinkled piece of paper, the crayon drawing of the stick-figure soldier. My hero dad. Beside it, in a shadow box, was the tiny hospital wristband with Luke's name on it. Below that, folded with perfect military corners, was the American flag from a fallen comrade's funeral. Maya stood frozen, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the glass over the drawing. I thought you threw all this away," she whispered. "I lost my direction," Ethan said, his voice steady. "Not my memory." Luke stepped forward and put a hand on his father's shoulder. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry I didn't see." The three of them embraced. It was awkward at first, then tighter, steadier. No one said, "I forgive you." They didn't have to. The silence was filled with an understanding that went deeper than words. They returned to the kitchen. Maya, wiping tears from her eyes, said, "I have a week off in June. Is there a good hiking trail around here?" "Raven Hill Lookout," Ethan said, a smile breaking across his face. "You can see for miles." Luke's eyes lit up. "If you've got a spare saddle, I'd like to finally ride Valor." Karen laughed. "I'll walk with Maya, and if someone cooks like this again, I'll carry the cooler." Ethan raised his mug of tea. Then this summer, Fort Memory will have its first family camp. By the time the SUV rolled away, the sky was a deep violet, pricked with the first stars. Ethan watched the taillights fade, then turned and climbed the watchtower. From the top, the world spread out below him, a blanket of white under a sky painted with the last streaks of sunset. The tracks from his family's boots patterned the snow between the cabin and the barn. The window of the memory room caught the last light and glowed. The mountain wind slipped past him, cold and clean and real. Ethan rested his hands on the railing and whispered to the vast, silent wilderness, "Thank you for what's left." Below, Valor let out a quiet, contented nicker as if in answer. The fort was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of homecoming, and the watchman was finally at peace. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know your favorite part. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories like this one. And don't miss out. Hit that notification bell so you're always updated on our latest content. Your support truly means the world to us.